Hi, I'm Clara, and today's story will take you on a journey of betrayal and sweet revenge. The first thing I want you to feel is the quiet weight of a house that used to be a home. Imagine a small, two-story house with a garden that my father tended like a ritual. The roses were his pride. He would hum while pruning, and the whole street knew the smell of his soil on summer evenings. That house is where I grew up. That house is where my father died. And that house is where my stepmother decided she could rewrite everything. My name is not important. The people in this story are. My father, Richard, was a man who loved routine and fairness. He was the kind of person who left sticky notes on the fridge for me when I was a teenager. Dinner at 7. Don't forget your umbrella. He had a laugh that filled the kitchen and a stubborn streak that made him insist on doing things his way. He also had a will. A simple, clear will. He left the house to me, his only child, and set aside a modest trust for his wife, my stepmother, Evelyn, to live comfortably but not to control the property. Evelyn arrived in our lives when I was 22. She was polished, practiced, and always perfectly coiffed. She wore perfume that smelled like money and had a laugh that sounded like applause. At first she was charming. She brought casseroles and offered to help with bills. She called my father darling in a way that made him glow. But charm can be a costume. Over the years, the costume slipped. Small things changed. My father's favorite chair moved to the guest room, his tools disappeared from the garage, and conversations that used to be easy became guarded. Evelyn began to speak for him, to finish his sentences, to correct him in front of me. It was subtle. It was poisonous. When my father passed, the house felt hollow. Grief is a physical thing, a pressure behind the eyes, a hollow in the chest that makes the world too loud. I remember the funeral like a film reel. The minister's voice, the smell of lilies, the way Evelyn stood so close to the casket that she seemed to be trying to merge with the memory. People said the right things. They hugged. They told me to take my time. I did. I read the will at the lawyer's office with my hands shaking. The document was clear. The house to me. A life estate for Evelyn. She could live there, but she could not sell it or change the title. The trust was modest but fair. My father had been careful. He had been kind. Then Evelyn changed. The first sign was a phone call 2 weeks after the funeral. Her voice was syrupy. "Darling," she said, "I've been thinking. It would be easier for everyone if we just consolidated things. You know how complicated probate can be." She suggested simplifying the estate. She suggested I sign a document that would let her manage the property, temporarily. I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. My hands tightened around the phone. I said no. She didn't take no well. She began to show up at the house more often uninvited. She rearranged my father's things. She told neighbors that I was difficult and ungrateful. She started to hint that the will might not be as ironclad as I thought. "Legal documents can be messy," she said once, smiling like a shark. "People change their minds." She would say it in front of the neighbors, in front of the gardener, in front of anyone who would listen. Each time she said it, a small, hot ember of panic grew in my chest. The worst moment came when she called the bank and tried to move funds from my father's account into an account she controlled. The bank refused without the proper paperwork, but the attempt was a message. She was testing boundaries. She wanted to see how far she could push. She wanted to make me feel powerless. Powerlessness is a heavy, humiliating feeling. It sits in your throat and makes your voice small. I remember standing in my father's kitchen, the sunlight cutting across the table, and feeling like the house itself was watching me be diminished. I would wake up at night with my heart pounding, imagining Evelyn in my father's chair, imagining her signing papers that would erase my inheritance. I replayed every conversation, every smile, every small slight. I felt betrayed not only by Evelyn but by the idea that the people who loved my father could be so quick to rewrite his wishes. But grief and fear can also sharpen you. They make you notice things you might have missed. I started to pay attention to Evelyn's patterns. She had a habit of leaving receipts on the counter. She liked to keep copies of things for her records. She used the same notepad at the kitchen table. She was meticulous in a way that made her dangerous. I began to document everything. I took photos of the house as it was. I wrote down conversations. I saved emails. I printed the will and kept it in a folder. I told myself I was being practical. I told myself I was protecting my father's wishes. But there was another truth. I was preparing for a fight I hoped I would never have to fight. The community took sides without realizing it. Some neighbors were sympathetic. Others were quietly amused by Evelyn's confidence. She had a way of making people assume she was in charge. She would say things like, "Oh, Clara is so young. She probably doesn't understand how these things work." The implication was clear. I was naive, inexperienced, replaceable. That stung. It made me feel small in a way that had nothing to do with my age. I want you to feel that sting. I want you to understand why the next steps mattered so much. This wasn't about money alone. It was about respect. It was about honoring a man who had been the center of my life. It was about refusing to let someone else rewrite his legacy because she had the audacity to believe she could. So, I did what any person who refuses to be steamrolled would do. I started to gather proof. I started to watch. I started to wait for the moment when Evelyn would overreach. And when she did, I would be ready. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday. I was at work when my neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, called me in a voice that trembled. "She's changing the locks," she said. "Evelyn's at the house with a locksmith." My stomach dropped. I left immediately, the rain soaking through my coat, and arrived to find a locksmith's van in the driveway and Evelyn standing on the porch with a smile that was all teeth. "Clara," she said, as if she'd been waiting for me to arrive so she could perform the next act. "I thought it would be simpler if I handled the maintenance. You know how busy you are." She held up a set of keys like a trophy. The locksmith handed them to her with a professional nod. I felt my throat close. "You can't change the locks," I said. My voice sounded small even to my own ears. She laughed, a sound that was meant to be light. "I can if I'm the one living here," she said. "It's for security." Her eyes flicked to the folder in my hand, the will, the printed emails. She didn't know I had them. She didn't know I had been watching. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and let the adrenaline settle into a cold, focused clarity. The fear that had been a dull ache became a tool. I realized that if I wanted to protect what was mine, I needed more than emotion. I needed a plan. I needed proof that would stand up in court and in the court of public opinion. I needed to expose Evelyn's pattern of manipulation in a way that would make it impossible for her to gaslight anyone into believing she was the victim. I started with the obvious: documentation. I compiled every email, every text, every receipt that showed Evelyn's attempts to control accounts or move assets. I made copies of bank statements that showed suspicious transfers. I printed the locksmith invoice and circled the time and date. I photographed the new locks and the locksmith's van. I wrote down the names of neighbors who had seen her acting possessive. I created a timeline that read like a slow-motion crime scene: dates, actions, witnesses. But documentation alone felt clinical. I needed something that would cut through the polite assumptions people made about stepmothers and widows. I needed to show motive. I needed to show that Evelyn had been planning this for months, maybe years. That meant digging into patterns. The way she had isolated my father from friends, the way she had subtly redirected his attention, the way she had cultivated a narrative that painted me as difficult. I started to interview people quietly. I asked the gardener about the tools that had gone missing. I asked the mail carrier about packages. I asked the neighbor who had once seen Evelyn on the phone, whispering about what she'd heard. People were hesitant at first. They didn't want to get involved. But when I explained that this was about honoring my father's wishes, they opened up. One neighbor, Tom, told me something that made my blood run cold. "She told me once," he said, "that she'd always wanted a house like this. She said it like it was a plan." He shrugged, as if that made it less sinister. It didn't. It made it worse. It showed premeditation. It showed that Evelyn had been imagining this life for herself long before my father died. I also hired a private investigator. That felt like a big step. expensive and dramatic, but I needed someone who could follow paper trails and dig into accounts without raising Evelyn's suspicion. The investigator found things I hadn't expected, a pattern of small transfers from my father's accounts to a joint account Evelyn controlled, odd invoices for home improvements that were never done, and a notarized document that had been signed in a shaky hand months before my father's death. The document was ambiguous, but it was enough to suggest that Evelyn had been trying to create a paper trail that would support her claims. Every discovery tightened the knot in my chest. I felt rage, yes, but also a cold, methodical satisfaction. This was no longer just about hurt, it was about justice. I began to map out how I would reveal the truth. I didn't want a messy courtroom spectacle. I wanted a reveal that would make the neighbors, the bank, and the lawyer see the pattern all at once. I wanted Evelyn to be exposed in a way that left no room for her to charm her way out. The plan had 3 parts. First, legal. I would file an emergency petition to prevent any further changes to the property or accounts. I had the will, the timeline, and the investigator's report. I met with my father's lawyer and laid everything out. He was careful, professional, and quietly furious on my behalf. He filed the petition the next morning. That would buy me time. Second, social. I would gather witnesses and present the timeline to people who mattered: the bank manager, the neighbors, the notary who had handled the suspicious document. I wanted them to see the pattern before Evelyn could spin a story. I arranged meetings one by one and handed them the folder. I watched their faces as they read. Some were shocked. Some were angry. Some were quietly relieved that someone had finally connected the dots. Third, theatrical. I would create a moment where the proof could not be ignored. I am not a vindictive person by nature, but I understood the power of a staged reveal. I arranged a small gathering at the house under the pretense of sorting through Dad's things. I invited the lawyer, the bank manager, the notary, and a few neighbors who had been supportive. I told Evelyn it would be a private family meeting. She accepted, of course. She loved being at the center of attention. In the days leading up to the meeting, I rehearsed what I would say. I wrote a script in my head and then tore it up. I wanted my words to be honest, not performative. I wanted the evidence to speak. I practiced breathing slowly so my voice wouldn't shake. I imagined Evelyn's face when she realized she had been outmaneuvered. I imagined the relief that would wash over me when the truth was finally seen. But planning revenge is not just logistics. It's emotional preparation. I had to steel myself against the temptation to gloat. I had to remember that this was about restoring what was right, not humiliating someone for sport. I also had to prepare for the possibility that Evelyn would fight back, that she would lie, that she would try to turn the room into a stage for her own victimhood. I rehearsed responses to her likely manipulations. I practiced staying calm while letting the evidence do the work. On the morning of the meeting, the house felt like a held breath. The roses in the garden were damp from the night's rain. The lawyer arrived with a briefcase. The bank manager carried a folder. The notary looked nervous. I stood at the doorway, the folder with the will and the timeline pressed to my chest like armor. Evelyn arrived in a dress that said she expected to win. She kissed cheeks and smiled at the neighbors as if she were the grieving widow who deserved sympathy. She did not know what was coming. She did not know that the quiet, grieving daughter had become a woman with a plan. When the door closed and the chairs were arranged, I felt the old fear flicker. Then I remembered why I had done all this. I remembered my father's sticky notes, his laugh, the way he tended the roses. I remembered the will. I took a breath, opened the folder, and began. I started with the will. I read it aloud, slowly, letting each sentence land like a small, undeniable truth. To my daughter, the house and property, I read. To my wife, a life estate and a modest trust. The room was quiet. Evelyn's smile tightened. She shifted in her chair, the way someone does when they realize the script they've been following might be changing. Then I laid out the timeline. I showed the locksmith invoice. I showed the bank statements, with transfers circled in red. I handed the notary the document that had been signed in my father's shaky hand and asked him to explain whether it looked legitimate. He frowned and said, "This was notarized, but the circumstances are suspicious." The signature is inconsistent with other documents I've seen. The bank manager flipped through the statements and said, "These transfers are irregular. We would never move funds without proper authorization." The lawyer leaned forward and said, "This is enough to file for immediate injunctive relief." Evelyn's face changed in stages. First, disbelief. Then anger. Then a practiced calm that was meant to look like wounded dignity. "This is ridiculous," she said, voice smooth. "I'm the one who kept this house running. I was there for him." She reached for the sympathy card, the one she'd played so often. "You're making accusations without proof," she said, looking at the notary as if he might rescue her. But the proof was there in black and white, in receipts and witness statements. "Tom," the neighbor, spoke up. "She told me she wanted this house," he said. "She said it like it was a plan." Mrs. Alvarez described seeing Evelyn on the porch with the locksmith. The gardener produced a list of missing tools. Each testimony was a small hammer blow. Evelyn's attempts to charm the room fell flat against the weight of documentation. Then came the moment I had planned for. The bank manager produced a copy of a check that had been altered. The ink was different. The signature looked like my father's, but the pressure and flow were wrong. The private investigator had a report showing that Evelyn had been in contact with a notary in another county, and that the timing of certain documents coincided with periods when my father's health was declining. The lawyer's expression hardened. "This looks like a pattern of undue influence," he said. "We will be filing for a full investigation." Evelyn's composure cracked. She stood up so quickly the chair scraped the floor. "You're lying," she hissed. "You're trying to ruin me." Her voice rose, and for a moment she looked like the person she had been pretending not to be. Raw, exposed, furious. She lunged for the folder on the table as if she could snatch the evidence away. The bank manager put a hand on the folder and said calmly, "Ma'am, please sit down." Her next move was predictable and ugly. She tried to play the victim. "I loved him," she said, tears suddenly welling in her eyes. "I took care of him. How could you do this to me?" It was a performance so practiced it felt rehearsed. But the room had already seen the pattern. The notary's testimony, the altered check, the timeline, they had created a narrative that could not be undone by crocodile tears. What followed was not a dramatic courtroom brawl but a slow, inevitable unspooling. The lawyer explained the legal steps, freezing accounts, placing a hold on the property, launching an investigation into the notarized documents. The bank manager confirmed that the transfers would be reversed pending inquiry. The neighbors, who had once been swayed by Evelyn's charm, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. She had traded authenticity for performance, and the performance had failed. I felt a strange mix of emotions in that moment. There was triumph, yes, a hot, satisfying rush that made my hands tremble. But there was also a deep, quiet relief, like the first breath after holding your breath underwater. The relief was not just about winning, it was about being seen. For months I had felt invisible, dismissed as young or difficult. In that room, with the evidence laid bare, I was no longer invisible. I was the person who had honored my father's wishes. Evelyn did not go quietly. She fought in the weeks that followed, filing counterclaims, calling neighbors, trying to spin the narrative. She hired a lawyer who tried to discredit the private investigator and to argue that my father had been of sound mind when he signed the documents she produced. But the pattern was too clear. The bank reversed the transfers. The notary's actions were flagged. The court placed a temporary injunction preventing any sale or transfer of the property. The life estate remained intact, and the trust was audited. There was a moment, weeks later, when I walked through the house alone. The rooms felt different now, not because the furniture had changed but because the air had shifted. The house no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a place where my father's memory could breathe. I sat in his chair and ran my fingers over the armrest, feeling the grooves where his hands had rested. I allowed myself to cry, not from anger but from exhaustion and release. People asked me afterward whether I felt vindictive. I always answered the same way. I felt justified. There is a difference. Vindictiveness is a hunger that never fills. Justice is a settling of accounts. I had not set out to humiliate Evelyn for the thrill of it. I had set out to protect what my father had decided. The revenge, if you want to call it that, was a byproduct of doing what was right. It felt earned because it was rooted in truth and evidence, not in spite. There were consequences for everyone. Evelyn lost the trust of the community. She moved out of the house a month later, her head held high in the way of someone who refuses to admit defeat. Some people felt sorry for her. Others felt she had gotten what she deserved. I received messages from neighbors I barely knew, thanking me for standing up. The lawyer told me I had done everything right. The private investigator said, quietly, "You were patient. That's what won this." In the quiet after the storm, I learned something about myself. I learned that grief can be a teacher. It taught me to pay attention, to document, to trust my instincts. It taught me that justice is rarely instantaneous. It is a process that requires patience and courage. I also learned that people who try to take what is not theirs often underestimate the quiet ones, the people who grieve, who keep receipts, who remember the small things. They assume grief makes you weak. Sometimes it makes you relentless. Before I close, I want to say this. Revenge stories are satisfying because they restore balance. But the most satisfying revenge is the one that aligns with truth. I didn't set out to be cruel. I set out to be fair. I set out to make sure my father's wishes were honored. When the evidence was laid out, the truth did the rest. If there's one thing I want you to take away, it's this. When someone tries to rewrite your life, gather the facts, hold your ground, and let the truth speak. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, and inevitable. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button and tell us in the comments, what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed? And, of course, subscribe for more stories like this.